Welcome to today's live stream. Today we're going to be looking at the Red Canary 2023 Threat Detection Report. We're going to be examining some trends in cybersecurity, some trends with emerging threats. So let's go ahead and dive right into this. We'll read this report, and I want to highlight some few things that stuck out to me. If you have any questions, let me know. Leave a chat, leave a comment. Be happy to help answer your questions. All right, welcome. We're going to be looking at the threat detection report from Red Canary. So let's go ahead and jump right into this. Here's a table of contents, and I'll be linking this in the description here. So if you want to read about these, go ahead. This is a report Red Canary put out. Red Canary is a threat intelligence agency, and they also have some products. But they compiled some data, and they made this available for anybody to download and take a look at. So I think it's pretty helpful. So, of course, there's going to be some marketing lingo in here, but there are some insightful trends here as well. And I'm going to skip through some of the fluff. This is basically some of the fluff here that we see. This part is where we get in the meat of this. We're talking about ransomware. Overall, Red Canary says that they detected less ransomware attacks in 2022 than they did in 2021. But they attribute that to a lack of visibility of the ransomware attacks, not so much a lack of ransomware attacks. So just because they don't see as many threats doesn't mean the threats aren't out there. And we do see, some ransomware attacks in 2022 against the Costa Rican government and Los Angeles School District. And each of these are clickable links, so if you do want to read more about those, it's pretty helpful. It does pull from other sources, so these attacks were referenced using recorded futures analysis. Red Canary is stating that they had a shift in dynamics of the ransomware groups. We had a fall of this ransomware group CompTIA, and a rise of some other ransomware groups like Qbot, Iced ID, and Zloader, which is pretty interesting. Those are changed basically to Black Basta, Quantum, and Royal. So these all used to be managed by the CompTIA ransomware gang, and now that's kind of been shifted into these other ransomware groups. Now, also one of the things they've noted is that there's a shift towards just extortion without the ransomware. A lot of times you'll have what are known as double extortion attacks, where you'll have a ransomware attack coupled with the ransomware gang threatening to release information to the public. Well, we're finding out that a lot of ransomware groups are just skipping the ransomware part and just doing right to the extortion part. So they're kind of getting more and more lazy, which is kind of interesting. And then you could read a little bit more about that on the ransomware trend page. There's a lot more into this, so I'm going to keep skimming through. As this title says, with phishing attacks, macro type attacks are again phased out more for compressed file attacks or web application container attacks. So that's kind of interesting. Now, these are basically, you're shifting away from macros in the email, usually targeting like an Outlook or Microsoft environment, probably because the protection mechanisms against those macros have become a little more robust, I'd say. And then we do see more types of container files like ISO files and virtual hard drive files that are being placed and used to be delivery methods. We're also seeing more attacks targeting search engine optimization, SEO poisoning, and malvertising, which is malicious advertising. So whenever you do SEO poisoning, you're basically attacking the availability of a site by disrupting its search engine optimization, how it ranks in search engines like Google. So that can be pretty damaging to a business without actually doing a denial of service attack. So it's a pretty creative way of doing an attack. And then you have malvertising, basically promoting fake advertisements or using sponsored links that don't get picked up right away by Google or by Microsoft advertising, and then having those go to malicious links and malicious websites. And once they do get flagged, the attacker just takes down the website, publishes a new website. We also have LNK and MSI files, MSI being Windows installer files. And we do see LNK files as well. They're basically a way, through LNK files, adversaries can perform or execute binaries and scripts, so that's pretty interesting. And those can be pretty damaging as well. USB attacks, I don't think these are ever going to go away because they're pretty easy. I had experience doing penetration tests using USBs. What I would do is I would drop some USBs with some malware on them in the parking lot of the target. And basically you'd have employees find a USB in the parking lot. It looks nice. You pick it up. They plug it into their work computer, see who it belongs to, trying to be a nice person, and then you gain access to their system. So those are always going to go. Always going to happen. There are also some pretty nice blurbs in here. I'm not going to hit everything. And we also have a shift in the types of command and control frameworks that are being used. So obviously attackers have often used Metasploit and Cobalt Strike. We also are seeing a couple different types. We see Brute Ratel and Sliver as being other exploitation frameworks, along with Mythic, that are being used now alongside those traditional ones like Metasploit. So I think that's pretty interesting. Stealers are stealing malware or stealer malware. And these were in some of the major profile breaches. And these are designed to, as you would guess, steal data. Okay. And basically attackers are taking advantage of a lot of remote work or work from home scenarios, which I think is pretty interesting, very smart. So I think it's pretty useful to read about this. Some attacks include Uber and Okta. Okay, the Uber attack was pretty high profile in 2022. Redline, Raccoon, and Vidar were the top stealer malware that were being used there. We also see identity theft or attacks targeting identity access management techniques. Basically, attackers are using a technique where they're tricking users into accepting a multi-factor authentication request that they didn't initiate. So that can be pretty damaging. That's an attack that targets a lot of organizations that use multi-factor authentication. So when a user might, get a multi-factor authentication notification, they might just be so used to accessing those that they mindlessly just click it, and then the attacker bypasses that multi-factor authentication. Not to say that multi-factor authentication is bad. It's definitely very useful. So that's very helpful there. Attackers are also seeing targeting Office 365, Office 365 being a very common deployment. And there's a few attacks that have been pretty helpful or pretty useful for them. We also see email attacks, social engineering attacks are always on the rise. I think they're one of the most effective ways to get into a high security system. And you see that changing. If you're getting certifications, a lot of certifications are changing their training to try and combat a lot of those social engineering types of attacks. So I think that's very smart because if you compromise the right person in an organization, you can gain access to anything, basically. Now, there are some ways to... Right here, we see different test techniques being used right here. This is correlated to the MITRE attack framework. So we see the attack testing techniques that were... The MITRE attack techniques that were tested and what were used in the real world. So you can see, what percentage of the tests are being effective, what's targeting like things that are actually being used. So I would recommend you take a look at that. And we see the real world techniques and the test techniques compared here. So they go into in-depth about this, which is pretty helpful. All right, now here, this section is all about the threats. So that was about the trends. Now we see the threats. We see different threats here. These are the top methodologies. You see like old players like Mimikatz. We see Qbot being very, very much used here. And you see the top 10 being used right there. Now, of course, there's lots of different threats out there. And basically what Red Canary has done is they've ranked each of these threats and they've given us a synopsis of each one. So that's pretty helpful. Qbot, sometimes known as Quackbot also. It's usually targeting financial companies or the financial sector. Usually it's done through email, like a phishing attack, and then it compromises a Windows-based machine. A lot of financial services use Windows-based operating systems. So it runs PowerShell commands, usually through some sort of payload. That's just the takeaway there. And I'm not going to go into all of these, so let's just skip through. But I do recommend taking a look at some of these. They're pretty helpful. Like Mimikatz, this has been around since 2007. Basically, it abuses Windows authentication methods. It's pretty helpful, and it's used for pass-the-hash types of attacks too. So, and it tells you that in this article. So definitely, if you're not familiar with Mimikatz, definitely check out the article and take a look. You should be familiar with that at this point. And by this point, I mean any point in your cybersecurity career. So definitely take a look at that. So I definitely recommend reading these top 10. Pretty helpful. And this is the point of threat intelligence. Of course, we're trying to learn about the current threats, become aware of the current threat environment, and find ways that we can combat that. Yellow cockatoos sit here as a featured threat, not on the top 10. It does search engine poisoning, and it is designed to trick users into installing a certain type of file, like a .NET file, usually coupled with a remote access Trojan. So that's pretty helpful for attackers, not helpful for people being targeted. And then we have a couple other featured threats here. Again, I'm not going to go through all of these. Now let's go to the techniques section. This is where we see the attack, the threats. Now we're seeing the techniques. The primary technique we have are Windows Command Shell, Windows PowerShell being very popular. Of course, if you gain access to Windows PowerShell, you can do pretty much anything you want on the Windows device. We still see Run DLL 32 being utilized. That was very popular a few years ago. Process injection, service execution. These are all staples, very common attack vectors that we see over the years. But again, just like the threats, Red Canary goes through each of the techniques here. Talks about why they use PowerShell, why they use all these different threat vectors. So I'm just going to skim through these, and I want to get to the next section here. Run DLL 32. If you're not familiar with that, definitely read up in this section on number 5. This is a way to exploit dynamic link libraries, which are a way to update portions of a software program within a Windows environment. So we'll just I'll go through here. And then they do have some featured techniques that are not on the top 10, which I think they do a nice job making this visually pleasing. And we go through a lot of these threat reports, but this one's pretty good. Okay, so we have our techniques here. And then let's go ahead and get to the last section here. It even goes into, like, for example, this one, Mark of the Web bypass, gives you screenshots and shows you how this would look like and how this is executed. So that's pretty helpful. And it shows you the different types of extensions that could be involved in this type of attack. So it's a really good way of learning about these types of attacks that you'll see in the wild. And it tells you not only what the attacks do and how to do them, but also how to protect against them. So I think that's pretty helpful. So these are the techniques, and that's pretty much how it follows up. This is that multi-factor authentication request generation I was mentioning earlier that tricks or abuses multi-factor authentication requests. So it talks about how attackers are doing this. And basically, it's exploiting this new term that we're seeing, multi-factor authentication fatigue, where users are being asked to use multi-factor authentication for everything, from their bank to their work. Everything uses multi-factor authentication. So the attackers take advantage of that. They send a false multi-factor authentication request to the user to try and get them to click on it, and then they'll bypass with that legitimate click by the user, or I mean, they've tricked the user into doing it, into bypassing the multi-factor authentication login, or basically confirming it. So very helpful. I definitely recommend taking a look at this Red Canary report. It's free to download, and if you need one, check a link in the description. But I hope this is helpful for you. Good overview. It's really nice to keep abreast of these threats, so thanks so much for joining me, and I hope this really helped. If you have anything you want me to cover in the future, please leave a comment or talk in the description. Okay, and guys, in the stream here, I'm going to talk just some of these comments you guys have. So, hey, no problem, Hamza. I'm happy to do these videos. I'm glad they're helpful for you. And Wolf, you want to know if you want to get you have your Network Plus, A Plus, and Sec Plus. Should you get your Pen Test, CISA, and finally take the CASP? Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I would recommend probably CISA next, CISA Plus next. If you have 5 or more years of experience, you might want to get considered like an ISACA CISA. It depends on what you want to do in the industry. So if you want to do more cybersecurity analyst stuff, get the CISA Plus. If you want to do governance, risk, and compliance, I'd recommend like ISACA CISA. If you want to do penetration testing, do Pen Test Plus or Certified Ethical Hacker. And then CASP Plus is a really great advanced certificate. It assumes you know Cloud Plus, CISA Plus, and Pen Test Plus. But yeah, that's great. But any more questions before I sign off today? I appreciate you guys joining in. Okay. Well, that's going to wrap up the stream for the day. Thanks so much for